This video you're about to watch is of a presentation I recently gave at McGill University in Montreal, Canada at the Neurosurgical Simulation and Artificial Intelligence Learning Center. In attendance was the center's director, Dr. Rolando Del Maestro, along with his team and students, as well as Dr. Shelagh Robinson, a psychologist and professor at nearby Dawson College where I presented the previous day. Dr. Del Maestro, in addition to being a retired neurosurgeon, is a leading expert on Leonardo da Vinci, owning one of the largest private collections of Da Vinci material in the world. In this 53-minute presentation, we talk about what made the brains of Leonardo da Vinci and Benjamin Franklin so different, how the human body is mechanically designed for mirror movement, how manual transfer learning makes better surgeons and active people in general, the nature and nurture of human handedness, our brain's corpus callosum, glial cells, Broca's area, and multilingual capabilities, the directionality of written languages, the spontaneous mirrored movement of young kids, dual dominance in sports, the brain of Albert Einstein, ambidextrous surgeons, and some famous people on the spectrum of mirror movement development, including Plato, Hippocrates, Thomas Jefferson, Queen Victoria, Mahatma Gandhi, Nikola Tesla, MC Escher, Paul McCartney, the ancient Greeks, and more. If you prefer watching a shorter 26-minute raw video draft of this presentation, you'll find a link in the video description here below. Also, not included in this video is the initial opener and Q&A at the end, where we talk a whole lot more about the brain and handedness, spatial awareness, reaction time, high precision balance, body realignment, neuroplasticity, cultural perceptions and reasons for sightedness, advantages of dual dominance in sports, and more. If you want to see that additional footage, you'll see the link also in the video description below. Well, thank you all very much for having me. I'm Jim Houliston from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I am an artist, I'm an athlete, I'm an educator, and I'm an author, all of which I'm sure is crystal clear when you look at this slide right here. I am also a bilingual tour guide in Philadelphia. My office, quote unquote, is right at the foot of the Liberty Bell and Independence Hall. I give our tours bilingually in English and Spanish. I lived many formative years between San Diego, California, and Tijuana, Mexico, where I was attending San Diego State University for grad school. I also dropped out of San Diego State University for grad school after getting way too interested in all the work that I was doing with immigration organizations south of the border and working with Americans. To have the same experience that I was having in Mexico. I returned, though, to San Diego State University every semester for 5 years to present in a graduate level class called The Life and Culture of Tijuana. So it is fantastic to be back in a university presentational setting. I spent the last 10 years practicing something called MMD, which stands for Mirror Movement Development. And I ultimately got into it because of rehabilitation purposes from skateboarding. My blog, my activities group, my YouTube channel talks all about mirror movement development. I've been skateboarding since the age of 12. I'm now 39. I can skateboard for longer than ever because of this practice of mirror movement development. I had about a 1.5 year period where I had to stop skateboarding, where I was instead going to chiropractors constantly to try to get my body realigned. And chiropractors, I really like them because they practice and they honor and they do those adjustments with MMD. They will give you mirrored adjustments, but because the muscles of the body are not also working in mirror development, I ultimately never got better until just out of desperation, I one day decided, let me try skateboarding switch. It was the only thing that I couldn't do, or excuse me, it was the only thing that I could do that didn't hurt my body. I grew up right-handed, so I now do everything left-handed, but with switch skateboarding, anybody here know what switch skateboarding is? So I grew up doing everything right-handed, I now do it left-handed, so that included skateboarding. With skateboarding, I spent from the age of 12 until 22 with my left foot forward on the skateboard, pushing with that right foot. And then always jumping from one side, falling from one side, all of that until deciding to switch that stance completely. And in the moment of first trying, I felt like I couldn't actually do it. It just felt so impossible, but it was the only thing that didn't hurt my body, so I went back the next day, and then the next day, and then the next day. And then 4 years of exclusively skating switch stance, I started being able to do tricks. My body was feeling realigned. It was feeling incredible. So I then went back to skateboarding in that traditional stance just out of curiosity to see how I would do. And I was very nervous because I didn't want to mess my body back up, but I found that I was immediately able to do new tricks. And that concept is actually called manual transfer learning, where your more dominant side gains proficiency when you focus simply on that less dominant side. So in that moment, I just thought, this is incredible. What would happen if I started doing everything else switch, aka in mirrored motion? So that was 10 years ago. I began writing left-handed in the traditional direction in grad school. Now, this is something that should take place gradually over time. I didn't just say, all right, I'm going to start doing everything switch stance. The body, and especially the brain, needs that time to recuperate, because when you're doing this stuff, your brain's going to be feeling a bit fuzzy, and that would only make sense because the layman science of mirror movement development is you're sending blood flow to that opposite brain hemisphere, which does a lot of incredible things, all of which I'll talk about here in a bit. I started writing in mirror direction about 3 years ago, once I learned that it was something that Leonardo da Vinci was doing in all of his personal notebooks, and just realized it was just much more mechanically advantageous to do that using your left hand. And then by this time, I had an interest to start mirror reading. And so I thought of hiring some developers to make an app. I was going to call it the Da Vinci app, but then doing a bit more research, I came across mirrorread.com, which was produced by our own Dr. Shelagh Robinson here in the room. And ever since I discovered this, I began to use it more and more and more. This is what I use now whenever I'm reading anything by preference. I will put it in that mirror direction, read it. This makes it very, very easy. There's an app for iPhone as well, but you can use this for any web browser tool. Now, you might think this sounds all fine and dandy, but what does it have to do with what we do here at the Neurosurgical Simulation and Artificial Intelligence Learning Center? That, my friends, is a great question. So, before I would answer exactly that, how many of you have ever looked into a mirror? You noticed a general symmetric distribution of eyes, ears, nostrils, lips, two hands, mirror design, and your feet, and ever wondered, why don't I have the ability to use both sides equally? Anybody ever wonder that? Look in the mirror, a couple of us. Yeah, well, that makes so much sense because the human body is physically designed for symmetric movement. And I'm going to get into more of that here for a bit, which, by the way, this sketch was completed by somebody who had a masterful spatial awareness and who was a big practitioner of mirror movement development, Mr. Leonardo da Vinci. I'll talk about him quite a bit more here a little bit later. But in our world of surgery, one in which you're all very familiar with or becoming even more familiar with, there are many advantages to having sheer proficiency in bimanual movements. It should be obvious that when you're doing a surgery, whether it's on the brain or the physical body, you're dealing with this bilateral body, and that there would be certain advantages to being able to use either hand interchangeably when getting into certain cavities, even with the machines to do this remotely. The traditional terminology for this has been the word ambidexterity. Now, the word ambidexterity, I still use it. I don't love it, though. The term ambidexterity literally means right-handed on both sides. As humans, if you look at both of your hands, you don't have two right hands on both sides. You have a left hand and a right hand. They are both mirrored designed. So the word that I use in my book is dual dominance. I'll still use ambidexterity because it's what's understood generally by people, but I'll use dual dominance to work to... So much of this has to do with correct terminology here and allowing people to conceive of what's actually possible when it comes to bilateral movements. On the flip side of ambidexterity is ambisinistrality. And to be ambisinistral literally means left-handed on both sides. And what ambisinistral means is that you're really good at using, you're terrible at using both hands. So big slap in the face for anybody who's a lefty here. And even in French, your own word, gauche, what does that mean? Anybody?
Bad, incorrect. Yeah.
Bad, incorrect, clumsy, awkward. Yeah, even in Spanish, the word sinistro, siniestro, is left-handed, and it means bad. So culturally speaking, we go back centuries with this this concept not even really being on the mental radar for many people, even though every time you look back into a mirror, you see a bilateral human body staring right back at you. The human body is designed for this. Again, I refer to this as dual dominance. Now, of course, there's certain asymmetries within the body. You can look at the DNA spiral, a lot of different things. They'll go one asymmetric way. But as far as mechanical movement goes, the human body is designed for symmetric movements. Bilateral species all under the sun have basically a 50-50 split in dominance all over the world. Humans, we're the only ones who don't have a 50-50 split. It's more like a 90-10 split. 90% right-handed compared to 10% lefty. It's a big difference between all other bilateral species under the sun. But one big explanation behind that has to do with our choices of practice and design and some of the things that we do uniquely. Compared to all other species under the sun, we do some pretty unique things. We're the only species under the sun to sit around at a rectangular dinner table, or a table even like this. If we were all to be eating here, if everyone was right-handed and you got stuck sitting next to a left-handed person, it'd be pretty awkward once you notice that your elbows are bumping into one another. When it comes to shaking hands, when I met Dr. Del Maestro this morning, I don't know if it would have been a little bit awkward if I went to you to go and do that originally. We seem to have accomplished it very well right there, but if I was to do that initially, that might have been a little bit weird. So there's certain advantages, of course, of declaring a culturally acceptable side, even when it comes to designing certain products, can openers, keyboards. I can probably look all around this room. That clock, thankfully, love that clock, but normally clocks, they're all designed in one opposite mirror direction. It makes a lot of sense in a commercial way to do it that way, so you're not dealing with all this different overhead and such. But as a result of this, we've insisted that we're only developing one stance in one side of our body. Babies even.
Back to, in medicine, we usually talk about a dominant hand and a non-dominant hand.
Mm-hmm.
How does that fit in to your sort of?
Well, in general, it fits in because we're having the conversation today currently in humanity, where we've spent so many eons just developing one side primarily. The verbiage that I'll use is more dominant and less dominant to just sort of verbally leave room for the fact that it can be developed and trained over time. But it is a reality just based on the fact that I'm still, even after practicing for the last 10 years, my more dominant hand is still more proficient, but over time and practice, my less dominant hand has become very fluent in pretty much anything that I do. In fact, like my own journal, anytime that I'm writing anything, I use it, I'll write left-handed in that mirrored motion. Today, I can do anything from my left side. I'm still more dominant on that right. And of course, for my own self as my own guinea pig with all of this, my big question is, how dominant can one become on that quote-unquote less dominant side? And then the question obviously comes up as to how much of this is someone born with, but even more than that, it does come down to practice. Everything that I've learned, not only from my own story and experience, but the stories of other dual dominant practitioners. So I hope somewhere within there I might have answered that question.
In the operating room is not set up at all for a left-handed person.
Mm-hmm.
All the instruments are made for right-handed people.
Mm-hmm.
And so almost all left-handers become pretty ambidextrous.
Very much so.
In the sense that they make their left hand function like a right hand.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So obviously that starts the system. And you know, if you go back to Leonardo, I mean, one of the questions that you have is like, if he would have gone to school, and all the schools would have been taught by nuns at that time in Italy, and he was predominantly using his left hand. The left hand in Italian is sinistra, which just goes with sinister.
Mm-hmm.
And no nun would have allowed him to use his left hand to write.
No.
So he would have been a right-handed person.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the reasons that Leonardo was able to do what he was able to do with his left hand was he probably didn't go to school very much.
Mm-hmm.
Because if he had have gone to school, there's no way that he would have used his left hand very much.
Mm-hmm.
It just would not have been allowed.
Very much so.
He in one way is a bit of let's say, a little odd in the sense that he didn't go through the normal training that a person at that age would have gone through.
Mm-hmm.
And there were very, very few of his students, in fact, none that we know of, that were left-handed.
Mm-hmm.
And so the big difference between a right-hander and a left-hander is shading.
Right.
A left-hander always shades this way
Mm-hmm.
in drawings. A right-hander always shades this way.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at Leonardo, all his drawings are shaded this way.
Mm-hmm.
All the students are shaded this way, except his favorite student, Melzi, attempted to use his left hand very inefficiently.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting that we are allowing left-handed people to function more in our society now,
Mm-hmm.
who would not have been able to function very effectively at all
Mm-hmm.
in that society, let me say it from that point of view.
Mm-hmm.
So something is happening related to the non-dominant, dominant sort of situation.
Sure. An example that's even more contemporary to us is the artist M.C. Escher, who was very famous from the 30s through the 70s. And I mean, if you were to just Google images of M.C. Escher, his understanding of spatial awareness is out of this world. He was the one who has done the staircases that seem to go infinitely, the two hands drawing one another. He was someone who grew up with a preference on his left hand, but he was forced into his right hand in school. But then by the time he was ultimately out of that and free to do whatever, he found he was able to more or less equally use both, still with that preference on the left hand. But because, it's something that you mentioned in the beginning of this, when you have that preference of the left hand, you're going to be living in a world where you're going to be coming up against machines where it's going to be more convenient to use your right hand. The can opener is a perfect example. So on average, typical left-handed people, their corpus callosum will be about 11% bigger because there's more of that communication going on between the hemispheres because they're using both hands more often, which again, that layman's science, whenever I use my right hand, this brain hemisphere is firing off, and the opposite is the same with this other one. So.
What about the relationship between speech and handedness?
Broca's area. Well, like you mentioned, that Broca's area is in the majority of the left brain hemisphere for most people. Women and lefties, they can tend to have it on the right. It's not exactly a 90-10 split. It's about 70%. There's some strong right-handers who their Broca's area, weirdly enough, is also in their right hemisphere. I talk about an example within my book where I was driving. I was on a 2-hour drive on the interstate, and I was on my headset talking with my aunt at the time, and she was telling me about this variety of cuisine she was experimenting with. This was over a year ago. We were having this conversation, and I never heard of the cuisine, but I asked her how to spell it out. And while driving, I instinctively picked up my left hand, and I wrote it in mirror direction. And again, this was just something that I've been practicing for the last 3 years. In mirror direction, I started writing with that left hand 6 years ago. So when I see that I'm instinctively doing that, because of manual transfer learning, I don't lose any ability that my right hand has for writing. In fact, my right hand is better for writing now than ever. It just looks even better than when it did before I was working to learn dual dominance. So it would make it sound like my Broca's area is in fact replicating onto my other side. That's something that, of course, I think would be better to be shown in whether an MRI, brain scan, because I haven't had that happen yet, but I know of no other explanation as to how I can instinctively go ahead and use my left hand, knowing that my left hand is only being operated by this brain hemisphere. So it seems to be some sort of duplication that's going on.
You know, as I was mentioning, women tend to have much more speech on their right side if they're dominantly right-handed. Part of that is felt to be related to the idea that the women tended to use their hands together.
Mm-hmm.
Well, for example, in an evolutionary sense, let's say if we're evolving from some chimpanzee gorilla sort of combination, the males would have predominantly been protective, and therefore they predominantly would have been using their right hand for throwing rocks or whatever. And therefore that's conceptually why your speech would be associated with that right hand. I know of no biological reason why your speech in a right-handed person should be on the left side.
Mm-hmm.
What
True.
biological reason, what advantage would that have given to a species?
Mm-hmm.
I do know, however, that chimps, like chimpanzees, they also have speech, and they're related to us in the sense that they also have predominantly right-handed, and their speech is on the left side.
Mm-hmm.
So we have evolved in this way somehow. But when that evolution occurred, like I don't know in turtles, for example, I mean, if they had any type of speech or, lower animals, what would happen there? Would they have speech? Like I have no idea about dolphins, for example.
Mm-hmm.
They have a very developed brain. So are they right fin dominant? I don't know that, but it would be interesting.
That's right. The
Yeah.
proportions of chimpanzees that are right versus left, is it mimicking the human proportions of right versus left?
I don't think anybody's ever studied it. I do know, however, that some of the people at the Neuro were dealing with experiments where they removed parts of chimpanzees' brains to see what would happen related to their speech. And their speech was predominantly on the left side.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, I have no idea. I have no idea. In fact, you could argue that other species, and even in our chimpanzee relatives, who are not this way. I have no idea. No one's really looked at this in a See, the problem in the world's so dominantly right-handed.
Mm-hmm.
Who cares about these 10% who are left-handed, right? I mean,
Studying left-handed chimps just by which ones are reaching for that
Mm-hmm.
fruit, it sounds like it would be a pretty straightforward.
it's obviously a very complex sort of system from that point of view. And it fascinates me, really. It's really a fascination about this, the building of the right hand and the left brain.
Mm-hmm.
And how it, just give you an interesting story about Leonardo. When Leonardo was about 66, he was visited when he was in France. He was visited by a cardinal. And there's a scribe very carefully identified that Leonardo had had a stroke in his right hand.
Mm.
Now, if Leonardo had a stroke in his right hand, and his speech was on his left side, then you would have thought that he would have had a problem with his speech because the hand is very close to the speech area. He had no trouble with his speech whatsoever. And he went on drawing with his left hand to the end of his life. So it suggests one of two things. Either Leonardo had a speech on his right side, and the left hand was his dominant hand. And so he actually was one of these 1/3 of the individuals who are left-handed but have their speech on the right side. Those individuals tend to be more creative because, as you mentioned, their corpus callosum is larger. They can shift more information back and forth because they have to, because the world is not made for them. So they have to develop this extra sort of ability.
I know for myself, one of my major burning questions would be if we were to wake up tomorrow and everything was mirror flipped, all of our reading was done from right to left, you opened your drawer, your can opener was mirror designed, all of that stuff, I would then think that theoretically, as a result of living in that world, that even stuff like that Broca's area would then go ahead and switch over. I know of no reason as to why not, if it has to do with that mirror development. And all of this stuff that we're talking about, we're living in a world where, of course, the options are presented to you that are more advantageous for using your right hand, but MMD, it's a lifestyle choice. And when you choose to practice that, you have a lot of awesome benefits that happen. And Da Vinci, I think, is on a major spectrum of that. And I'll get into that here even more.
Well, let's go back. I mean, in Arabic, you're going from left to right, from right to left, right in your writing, correct? So you learn how to do that.
Yeah, actually, something interesting was when I was in Lebanon, we conducted a study and we did functional MRI to 3 lingual population people. So actually, in Lebanon, Arabic is our first our spoken language or mother language, and then everybody learns a second language. In my case, it was French, and then a third language, which is optional. Usually, it's English. And then I remember my functional MRI because I was one of the patients that did the MRI. And actually, when I was, so the investigators were showing us like texts in Arabic, French, and English. And they are doing a functional MRI acquisition after each set of questions. So actually, I remember the Broca, so I'm right-handed, the Broca area in my left brain was very limited when I was speaking in English, when I was thinking in Arabic, in my mother tongue. And then in French, it was really very also localized. So it's a wider area, but it's really localized around the Broca area. However, because English is my third language, and it's because I was also in French hospitals, so I really rarely exercised my English, practiced my English. So when I started reading in English, all my brain like lit up on the functional MRI. So the left side, the right side, it was like wow. There was no Broca area, so it was all my brain that lit up because I think I was making such an effort to read in my third language. So I think it's really interesting. It maybe explain that when we do an effort for tasks that we are used to do like automatically, maybe we use both sides of our brain. We use our go and forth exchange to come up maybe with vocabulary, with the articulation. So I think it's also an interesting fact. And for the part where we write from French, so right to left, from left to right. So I think because we start like at the age of 2 or 3 learning both languages, so the switch is automatic. So for example, for me, if you will give me a piece of paper and ask me to write in Arabic, I will think for a second. So actually, it's very normal, and I had to think about it when you asked me you write from right to left, because for me it's very automatic. However, right now, because like I'm working in a French hospital and then I come here and I speak in English, sometimes when we are together I start talking in French and then so I have to switch to English. So it's more like not automatic, it's something I do on purpose. So it's really intriguing. We don't have answers for that. But yeah, so for the right to left, left to right, it's very automatic. However, switching languages, the Latin language, it's something that I think about.
Yeah, I know that if you have the people who speak 3 languages fluently, it appears that each language is sort of localized in its own area.
Mm-hmm.
So you can selectively remove the French or selectively remove your English. Yeah. But as you suggested, that third language seems to need much more of the brain to be able to function. Mm-hmm. So it may be taking information from other areas. But it is interesting if you're an Arab speaker and you're switching into English, you're switching completely. Mm-hmm. You know, if you think about that, you're going from writing from right to left. Suddenly, then you're writing from left to right. Mm-hmm. And you're reading the same way. Yeah. So you're switching your reading and switching your...
We had different notebooks, like notebooks that they have the margins on this side to write in Arabic, and notebooks that have margins on this side to write in English or French. Because as Bilal said, like we had to take the 3 languages at school, so we needed like separate notebooks.
However, for you it is automatic. Like if I give you a piece of paper and ask you to write your name in Arabic, you wouldn't think about it if you're. So it's very automatic.
Yeah, we just like, even if they give us like the wrong for example, if they give us the wrong ones, we just like automatically just switch.
Right? Like flip
it and write.
Yeah.
So you learn, it becomes more innate over time. I know Dr. Andrew Uberman from Stanford University talks about how the eyeballs are the only external part of the brain. They're not connected to the brain, but they're actually an external part of the brain. And being that they're so closer, that brain-body flow, whether you're going from right to left or left to right, that should have significant developmental...
It's interesting, if you think of your eyes have to do a completely different thing. Mm-hmm. You know, your eyes are going this way or this way.
Like if I could just.
And then if
have
you're
it-
Japanese or Chinese, you may be going this way.
I have been working with mirror reading for quite a while now, and it's something I present to my students on a regular basis. And I always ask at the beginning of the semester, who's left-handed in this class? And I say, do you read Arabic, Hebrew, or Farsi? And so we get some hands up, and I say, here's the stimuli. Who could read this sentence just a little bit faster? And it's not just right to left. The scanning pattern gives a little bit of an edge. You've already gotten used, it's a habit right to left. So there's a mechanical familiarity along with the mental. I've heard people say, we just jump to the other side of the letters. I'm like, is that what you do? You jump mentally to the other side of the letters. So there's mechanics, but there's also more than just mechanics. Yeah.
And I'll tend to do my best left-handed mirror writing after mirror reading for a while. There's a direct connection, correlation to it. I can always continue here with our presentation here. I've had this slide up here. There's a handedness preference that's even prenatal, that even in the womb, there's studies that show that more babies in the womb will prefer sucking their right thumb than their left thumb, which really shouldn't be surprising because, again, if we're talking genetics, you're receiving those genes from a slew of ancestors who have chosen to be more dominant on one side than the other and practice it subsequently. So it really shouldn't be a surprise to us. And kids, instinctively, they practice mirror movement development as they're growing. They're switching between sides. They're with grabbing, same thing with kicking, even instinctively mirror writing, which is something that we'll talk about here later. It's typically not until us as adults come along and we'll tell these kids, oh, you're grabbing with the wrong hand, you're doing it from the wrong side, you're doing the wrong direction, let me help you and teach you the right way, quote unquote, of doing it. So one great example of this is with Pat Venditti. He's a Major League baseball player. Since the age of 3, his dad taught him how to throw equally both left and right-handed. He just continued it through Little League all the way up until the major leagues. He actually has a special glove it's a completely symmetric glove, 6 handholds in it, so he can equally just switch it between both sides. So he's a completely ambidextrous pitcher. Does it equally ever since the age of 3. Another example of this is with EBA Jeremy. Ever since the age of 15, he was fascinated with the idea of working to learn his non-dominant side for sports, in particular for baseball. Because with baseball, switch hitting is a way more common thing than any other switch form of professional sports, because the typical switch stance for batters is in the right batter's box, which is slightly closer to first base. And even when you swing, as you go around, you end up in the trajectory naturally more towards first base. So on average, you will get onto first base more often if you can be really good at switch hitting. One of the best hitters from history was also one of the best switch hitters. His name Mickey Mantle. Mickey Mantle was really great as well. So EBA today, he's the captain of Team USA Beach Handball. He's the top in his sport. And again, he's just been working to learn this since the age of 15. So you might be thinking, well, that's really cool for EBA Jeremy and for Pat Venditti, who started working on this stuff when they were younger, but how much of this can I learn as an adult? And it's a spectrum of practice. Right here, I talk about each of these people here in my book. I have down here on the bottom right-hand corner Mahatma Gandhi. He started as an adult to work learning how to write left-handed so he wouldn't become so dependent on his right hand. I have Queen Victoria here on the bottom. She had an ambidextrous tutor who taught her as a teenager. Benjamin Franklin, I'll talk even more about him, but he spent 30 years as a mirror reader as well as an avid reader in the traditional direction. So he would have had a very abnormally symmetric brain, much like Einstein. Now, Einstein's an interesting one because there's no photographic evidence of Einstein writing left-handed, but at his autopsy, it was showed that he had an abnormally symmetric brain. His corpus callosum was thicker. He had a higher number of glial cells. I'll mention this here more in just a bit. Lord Robert Baden-Powell at the top. Not sure exactly when he started his dual dominance trajectory, but he ultimately is the man who started the Boy Scouts. Before starting the Boy Scouts, he, as a general, would train all of his troops to learn how to mount a horse from both sides, use a lance from both sides, as well as shoot a gun from either side. He didn't consider any of his soldiers completely trained unless they can do that. Before he started the Boy Scouts, in the year 1905, he wrote an introduction to a book called Ambidexterity, And in that introduction, he signs it both left and right-handed. And also the official Boy Scout handshake is what Dr. Del Maestro and I just did, that simple left-handed handshake. He was a huge promoter of this in the Boy Scouts. Leonardo da Vinci, talked quite a length here about Leonardo da Vinci so far. Nikola Tesla, as an adult, he worked to learn ambidexterity. He talks about in his own autobiography that he had learned proficiency in this as an adult. And then Thomas Jefferson, who is a predecessor of Benjamin Franklin. They have a lot of similarities. Author Walter Isaacson refers to both Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin as the avatars of the Enlightenment. When Thomas Jefferson was in France, replacing Benjamin Franklin as the ambassador to France, Franklin leaves, comes back to America, but while Jefferson is over there, he has a little accident while he's trying to jump over a fence to impress some woman, and he falls down and he breaks his right wrist. So he has to learn how to write left-handed. And the National Park Service website talks about him as doing this for the next 40 years, just to work to learn that dual dominance. And it was around that time, too, that Benjamin Franklin wrote an essay that he addressed to educators called A Petition of the Left Hand. He wrote it 11 years before he died, and in the essay, he addresses it to those educators. He talks about how both hands are designed for equal use and that we should be teaching kids how to develop them both equally. If you look at the essay, which I dissect at length in my book, it is obvious to me that no exclusive right-hander would have ever written that. Again, because of this concept of manual transfer learning, even in surgery, considering all the instruments they're designed for that right-hand dominance in mind, if you in your practice of whatever else it is that you are doing, that you can practice on that less dominant side, particularly in mirrored motion, because of manual transfer learning, you'll be better on your dominant side when you go to use it. One surgeon who's an expert in this is Dr. Catherine Coe out of Manhattan. She spent the last 30 plus years working to learn writing with her left hand, which is her less dominant hand, in traditional direction. And when it comes to surgery, she's only using her dominant side, but she feels she's way better at it because of that practice of focusing on that less dominant side development. She also, after already becoming a neurosurgeon, she believes that because of this practice, it sparked her creativity to ultimately become a fine artist. Her art is out of this world. Caravaggio style art that she does. Her art studio and neurosurgery practices in the heart of downtown Manhattan in New York City. I actually have an interview on my website with her, and she has a lot of awesome stuff to say about all of this. Another famous surgeon who was known for his dual dominant skill was Dr. Thomas Dent Mutter. He's Philadelphia famous. By the 1840s, he is 29 years old, and he is teaching surgeons years ahead of him. So he's very famous in the surgery community. He was most famous to the surgeons' wives as the young surgeon who rode beautiful carriages and dressed in matching suits with his carriages. Dr. Thomas Dent Mutter, in this Smithsonian article, it was talked about how he was noted to be highly dual dominant, that when he was doing surgery, it was said that he was able to accomplish twice as much, and that surgeons, when they were watching him performing these, they were baffled, wondering, this is incredible, this looks like organized chaos, how could we ever replicate this? He was world-renowned. So much so that the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia, for any of you who ever go to Philadelphia, this needs to be your spot. You can see right there on the left, that is the second tallest human skeleton on Earth. He's 7'6". He was acquired in the 1850s. When Dr. Mutter got him from a man in Kentucky, the man in Kentucky said, I will sell you this as long as you don't ask me questions on how I got it. So he's there in the Mutter Museum. He's standing right here next to a 3'6" tall dwarf skeleton. There are bones of Siamese twins inside of here, creepy things in jars of formaldehyde. It's also the only place on Earth where you can see slides from this man's brain, Mr. Albert Einstein, in all of its symmetric glory. Like I mentioned, his brain was noted to be abnormally symmetric, had a thicker corpus callosum and a higher number of glial cells. Although the idea of mirror movement development, quote unquote, growing the brain, his brain wasn't as big as the average human brain. The average human brain, 3 pounds. His was only 2.7. But if it was MMD formed, one can perhaps think like a Ferrari might be weighing less than a Toyota Camry. One is certainly going to be more efficient. So it may be something in regard to that. That is, at least from my end, speculative. Of course, there's much more research that could be done on that. Hippocrates, the father of modern medicine, the ancient Greeks, he was a big promoter of this. He had told us here to practice all the operations, performing them with each hand and both together, for they are both alike, your object being ready to attain ability, grace, speed, painlessness, elegance, and readiness. Contemporary of Hippocrates, Plato, he was convinced that the limbs are naturally of equal strength, balance, and ability, and that dominant-handedness wasn't part of our design, but rather misguidedly learned from our caregivers. Another one from history, Mr. Celsius, a first century Roman surgeon, said that surgeons should be ready to use the left hand as well as the right. So this is not a new novel concept. This is one that goes back many, many centuries. Another one also, Aristotle, he echoes this idea of dual dominance with what he has to say here about symmetry, recognizing it as one of three of the chief forms of beauty, along with order and definiteness, of which he says the mathematical sciences can demonstrate to a special degree. And of course, our main man, Mr. Leonardo da Vinci, he was one who was inspired by the writings of Aristotle. And this is not a messed up slide. I intentionally wrote it that way to give us all a little bit more practice here with mirror movement, his name. And then, of course, we can see right here examples from his notebooks. He wrote in his personal notebooks left-handed in that mirror direction, but it was noted that he would write right-handed traditional whenever he had to share something publicly with anybody. This is something that is, again, completely learnable. I can do this no problem to this day, as well as other practitioners who I know, who I talk about in my book at length, as well as on my website and YouTube channel. He was doing this since before the age of 21. That can be seen in this sketch of a Tuscan landscape that Da Vinci did by the age of 21. On the bottom here on the right, you can see it says Leonardo, written right-handed in that traditional direction, and then he has left-handed mirror writing in there as well. Those sketching etches that we can see here, various directions, swirling kind of all over the place here, but again, this was one that Da Vinci had done at 21.
It's felt at this time that Leonardo at the bottom is not actually Leonardo's writing.
Oh, no?
There are a number of places in, as you mentioned, in his books where he does write correctly. It's unclear as to whether he's writing with his right hand at that time or with his left hand. It appears that he's probably writing with his left hand, with his right hand.
Mm-hmm.
So like this whole thing would have been done with his left hand. All this drawing would have been done with his left hand because you can see the shading.
Mm-hmm.
And so he probably had the ability to write with both his right and left hand, but very, very rarely did he write with his right hand. And the only times he ever did it normally was if someone owed him a book, someone owed him money, he had to show it to someone in the correct writing style. So then he would write normally.
Mm-hmm.
So I also thought about this, but I've looked into it, and it doesn't appear that Leonardo is consistent when you see him write in his notebooks with the correct writing from left to right.
Mm-hmm. I know. I pulled this image from an article I found online. It was talking about an art center in Italy that was doing the research on this. At least according to that article, they were saying that it had shown he was writing with both hands, ambidextrally. There's more that can be, of course, known and researched on this. And in all of his notebooks, he doesn't mention just why he did this. So, of course, it's in a way a mystery. But again, when you look at people today who practice this and working to learn it, it's something that is learnable over time with a lot of practice. Again, because of that mechanical design of the human body for that symmetric movement. And again, out of all the 7,200 personal notebook pages that remain of Da Vinci, he never mentions why he did this. But one clue, he does mention in one of his notebooks, he's thanking God for having escaped from the quote-unquote murderers with just one dislocated hand. So it's possible he was doing this for rehabilitation purposes. Not sure. Again, he doesn't get into it. But I'm fascinated when you consider his fascination with the human body, with biomimicry, something that we can see with his engineering sketches of flying machines, different devices, war machines. We can see sketches here, the skeletons, the internal organs, which a lot of that we didn't know about until after Leonardo's death. It wasn't discovered until his personal notebook showed all these sketchings of cadavers that he was dissecting in secret. But one of my favorites here, of course, the Vitruvian Man, just drenched in symmetry right here. And back to that face that he had sketched, you can see there's that general symmetric placement of the eyes, of the ears, the nostrils. And I'm convinced that Da Vinci was fascinated by this observation and would have perhaps chosen to develop that dual dominance as a way to honor the body and a way to biomimic just what it was designed to do. And when comparing it to the best designed car, I see so many similarities between the best designed car and the average human body. You have the skeleton, symmetric frame. You have the symmetric frame of the best designed car in general. You have the exterior features of a car symmetrically placed. And then you even have, when you open up the hood of a car, the internal organs are all over the place, just like the organs of our body. But the best designed car, just like the average human body, if you were to slice it right down the middle, both sides would weigh the same, but you would never buy a car that only ever makes right-handed turns. So it seems funny that we would settle for the same with the human body. And again, I'm convinced that Da Vinci had a bit of observation on this and would have chosen to exercise that dual dominance to honor his body. That's my own theory on it. Wish he was here that we can all ask him. I know that we would love to know that for sure. But when you think about the genius of Da Vinci that we associate him with, it would appear obvious to me that he had practiced that dual dominance. When you look at his creativity, in particular when we look at benefits of mirror reading, we know that there's an activation more between both hemispheres. There's a structural improvement of glial cells in the corpus callosum, gray matter growth in that right brain hemisphere, improvement of working memory and mental rotation skills, just a lot of great benefits that occur in the body. And Da Vinci, he wasn't the first to be doing this sort of dual dominant handwriting. Ever since the 12th century BC, the ancient Greeks had a version of it here with boustrophodon. Boustrophodon is, Greek means like the ox plows. And imagine an ox plowing a field. It doesn't matter from what side that ox begins. They'll plow one line all the way down and then move down one line and then come back the other way and then continue doing it that way. Just like these lines here, you can see this fourth line up from the bottom. There's an S written in what would be our mirror direction. You go to the line below it, it's written in that traditional direction, so on and so forth. So that as you were etching this out into stone, you would ideally be switching the chisel and the hammer between both sides. Dual dominant form of handwriting since the ancient Greeks. And young kids instinctively practice this. Of course, the famous Beatle, Paul McCartney, the highly left-handed Beatle, he would get in trouble in grade school growing up because his teachers, they would open up his notebook and he would see he was writing a whole lot of stuff in mirror direction. No one taught him that. He was instinctively doing it because mechanically for the left hand, it's going to be easier writing that English script in that way. Someone who practiced this for 30 years was this man right here who I talk about constantly on my tour. Just like Dr. Del Maestro could probably talk for 2 days straight about Leonardo da Vinci, I could do the same with Mr. Benjamin Franklin. Anyone know anything about Benjamin Franklin here in the room? Somewhat? What would you happen to know of him?
He did an experiment where he tied a key to a kite.
Yes, he did. I'll show a slide of that here in a bit. Mm-hmm.
That's about it.
Yep, he did that. He definitely did that. So, Benjamin Franklin, he did a lot of things. He was a polymath. He was a statesman. He was a scientist. He was an inventor. But he preferred to be known most as a printer. And in the colonial era, whenever you are printing something, he had a special skill for composing, which meant that you would take the metal letters and you would put them together. And if you wanted to cut down on unnecessary printing, you would get really good at mirror reading. He was doing this from the age of 12 until 42. So these are the letters that he's putting together in a printing press. I can read some of these here for you at the very top. These are all Franklin quotes. Fish and visitors stink after 3 days. We can see right over here on the right, old boys have their playthings as well as young ones. The difference is only in the price. Over here on the left, the noblest question in the world is, what good may I do in it? And then the very bottom right here, 3 may keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. So there we go. Put in the traditional direction, probably be a lot easier for you here to see. But Benjamin Franklin, he's doing this for 30 years during work, and then after work, he's going home and he's reading books in the traditional direction. He was a book nerd, like you couldn't believe. All he wanted to do was read books. He actually didn't like going to church on Sundays with everybody because it got in the way of his study time. Because he's reading from left to right and right to left, his brain would have just been abnormally symmetric. And when you look at the polymathic tendency, he had to produce so many things very similar to Da Vinci's. Right here, I've got a cool Da Vinci quote. Who wants to read for me this? I can smell wood burning in here.
A beautiful body perishes, the work of art dies not.
There you go. Yeah. I'm guessing you read it mostly from that traditional side, but when you look at it, there's a certain beautiful symmetry to it here. As we look at it, we'll see that beautiful symmetry right here. Now, I know you mentioned you read Arabic, correct? So I'm guessing you can read that top line. Now, this is the same word. It's symmetry, and it is mirror fused in the center. The very top is Arabic. Below that is Hindi. Then we have Hebrew. Then we have Chinese. It's the same word, symmetry, bilaterally fused together. And what we can see here, for most of us who can't read that, is just a whole bunch of beautiful symmetry. It looks really cool. And then here in the middle, you can see that word symmetry. But because our brains are so conditioned to reading in one direction, of course, our eyes will immediately go to that right side with the familiarity. But the same exact thing is written on that opposite side, just in mirrored motion. Right here we can see, love this Benjamin Franklin quote, looks all fine and dandy, but then when I mirror it, it's going to be a little bit different right here, but it's still the same exact thing. And I love this quote here: an educated blockhead is a greater blockhead than an ignorant one. Mr. Benjamin Franklin. I'll get into a little bit here as to why he wrote that here in just a bit, but when I put them together, there's again another beautiful symmetry right here that I think Aristotle would have really liked right here. You might find that it looks even similar to this. And then you can take it a couple steps further and you can bring it together with other mirrored portions of the body. We again have those mirrored left and right hands, the feet, the eyes. Coincidence? It's all of this? I don't know. I don't think so. You got Benjamin Franklin and Leonardo da Vinci here, considered two of the smartest men perhaps ever, definitely one of the smartest men of their era. And Franklin, just like da Vinci, they only had a couple years of formal education. Benjamin Franklin, he actually only had 2 years of education in elementary school. Though by the time he was 42, he was completely retired. He was America's first millionaire, and he went on to invent the lightning rod. When he did that, he became the very first international celebrity amongst the Americans. This was very beneficial when our American Revolution was going on, because Benjamin Franklin, he was assigned by the other founding fathers to go over to France to be the one to convince them to give us a whole bunch of money to win the American Revolution against Great Britain. If Franklin didn't do that, we would not have won the American Revolution. But this lightning rod experiment, and ultimately creating the lightning rod, saving millions of homes, businesses, people all over the world, made him famous. And again, only 2 years of formal education. After he had this experiment, though, he went on to receive 5 honorary university degrees, 3 of which were doctorates. 1 from Harvard, 1 from Yale, 1 from Oxford. So, what was it that made them so different? It is the take-home of this presentation. You might be wondering, well, what exactly is that main take-home of this presentation? Wait for it. Your most thunderous Metallica style voice. Who can read for me? What is the take home of this presentation?
Practice MMD.
Practice MMD. And what does MMD stand for?
Mirror movement.
There you go. How do your corpus callosums feel now? Very nice. Very good. Now, as you probably have all gotten an idea, as you're working to mirror read and doing anything else with mirror movement, it's going to feel very challenging. Very challenging, just like eating healthy and working out can feel challenging, but like we know, it is good for us. MMD is the same thing. It's fortunately why a lot of adults don't practice it, but when you practice it, you actually do burn more calories. That's something that's reported by dual dominance practitioners. So I consider it the third of that pillar of longevity, next to healthy eating and exercise. If you want to know more about this, of course, check out my website, blog, YouTube channel. I wish you were all in Philly. You can come and practice with the other dual dominant practitioners that I introduced this to, teach them how to walk on handrails and mirror right and do chalk art, throwing, kicking with the last dominant hand, all of that fun stuff. But more information on my website. And if you want to read in the mirror direction from a physical book, you can pick up mine. It's on Amazon, the world's first biscriptal book, as you all saw it written in that mirrored and traditional direction. I get into more on the accounts of these folks. And that's about it. So thank you guys so much for having me. Of course, my email, any questions you have, let me know after all of this. So this was great. Albert Del Maestro, thank you very much for having me.